The wind swept across the open plains like a whisper of warning, carrying dust and the scent of rain. Evelyn Carter stood at the edge of her family's porch, her fingers clenched around the letter that had changed everything. The ink was faded, but the meaning was clear. The bank was taking their land. Her father's health had worsened, her mother's tears had dried into silence, and her younger brothers looked to her with a mixture of fear and faith. Evelyn had always been the strong one, the one who could read, negotiate, and fight for what was right. But even strength had limits in a world built to break women like her. She had tried everything: teaching, sewing, even bartering goods with the white townsfolk who barely looked her in the eye. Yet no effort could cover the growing debt. Then came the letter from the pastor, carrying a proposal from a man she barely knew, Luke McKenna, a rancher living on the outskirts of Iron Creek. The words were plain and businesslike. Mr. McKenna seeks a wife of sound character to tend to his home and assist in ranch duties. In exchange, he offers full settlement of the Carter family's debt. It sounded less like marriage and more like a transaction, and in truth, that's exactly what it was. The pastor hesitated even to hand her the letter. Luke McKenna's name carried a chill wherever it was spoken. Some said he'd killed a man and never spoke again. Others said he was simple, touched in the head after the war. The saloon keeper's wife swore she saw him once at the train depot, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that looked through you instead of at you. Evelyn's mother wept when she told her decision. "You can't go out there, Evia. That man's cursed. He don't talk, don't smile, don't come to church." Evelyn had only lowered her gaze and said softly, "Maybe he just needs someone who won't run from silence." When she boarded the wagon to Iron Creek, the sun was low and gold, bathing the land in the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory. The journey was long, through endless stretches of wild grass and quiet sky. She held her small bag in her lap, a Bible, a worn dress, and the hair comb her mother gave her on her 18th birthday. She'd left behind everything else, her family, her name, her freedom, in exchange for their survival. When she arrived, the ranch loomed ahead like a painting half-finished, a house of gray timber, weathered barns, and fences stretching into the distance. Cattle dotted the hills, and a single man worked among them, a figure carved in motion. He turned when the wagon stopped. Luke McKenna was not what she expected. His hair was dark and unruly, his face cut by sun and silence. There was no cruelty in his eyes, only distance, like a man who'd lived too long in his own thoughts. He nodded once in greeting but said nothing. The officiant, an older man from town, arrived that evening to perform the brief ceremony under the porch. The vows were short. Only Evelyn's voice filled the air. "I do," she said, her heart trembling but steady. "Luke, I do," came as a whisper, the only word he spoke that night. When the minister left, Evelyn stood in the doorway of her new home. The air inside was cold and still, the walls bare except for a rifle and a clock that had long stopped ticking. Luke lit a lamp and set it on the table before walking out to the barn without a word. Evelyn looked around at the silent room and exhaled slowly. She had married a stranger, one who spoke in gestures instead of sentences. But as the wind howled outside and the lamp flickered low, she told herself the truth she needed to believe. She had not come for love. She had come for survival. And yet, deep down, a quiet thought stirred. Perhaps survival could one day make room for something more. The next morning, Evelyn woke to the sound of roosters and the faint creak of a door swinging in the wind. Sunlight spilled across the floorboards, catching on dust motes that floated like gold flecks in the still air. For a moment, she forgot where she was, until her eyes landed on the rough-hewn walls, the single wooden chair, and the untouched space beside her bed. Reality settled back over her shoulders like a heavy shawl. She was Mrs. Luke McKenna now. The house was larger than it had looked from outside, yet it felt hollow, not unlived in, but untouched. There were no curtains, no photographs, no signs of warmth or memory. Everything was built for utility, not comfort. Even the dining table bore marks of knife blades and years of use, as if conversation had never once been served upon it. Evelyn washed, dressed, and made her way toward the kitchen. She found bread that had gone hard, a sack of beans, and a half-empty tin of coffee. It wasn't much, but she worked quickly, humming softly, an old hymn her mother used to sing. The rhythm of her voice felt like defiance against the quiet pressing in from all sides. Through the window, she saw him, Luke, already out near the corral, moving with unhurried precision. The horses obeyed him without words. He didn't whistle or call out. He simply gestured, and they followed. She watched him for a long moment, fascinated. There was strength in his silence, not coldness, but control. It unnerved her and intrigued her at once. When he finally returned, boots caked with dirt, he paused in the doorway, the morning light cutting across his face. Evelyn greeted him with a careful smile. "Good morning, Mr. McKenna." He only nodded once. She gestured to the table. "Breakfast is ready." He hesitated, then sat. They ate without speaking, the only sounds the clink of utensils and the wind brushing against the window. Evelyn fought the urge to fill the space with chatter about the weather, about the chores, but she sensed it would only make the silence heavier. Afterward, Luke rose, took his hat, and headed back outside without so much as a thank you. The door shut gently behind him. Evelyn exhaled. It wasn't anger she felt, it was confusion. How could a man live so completely alone, even while standing a few feet from another soul? By midday, she decided she wouldn't let the stillness win. She began cleaning the house, scrubbing floors, washing linens, and airing out rooms that smelled of dust and distance. She found tools carefully arranged in the storage shed, a man who lived by order. She also found a small wooden box in the corner of his desk, carved with initials. J.M. Inside was a single photograph. 2 boys in uniform, smiling proudly, their resemblance unmistakable. Luke and his brother, she realized. When Luke came in that evening, she was hanging clean sheets near the fire. His eyes flicked toward the box on the desk, and she froze, afraid she'd crossed a line. But he only looked at her, his jaw tightening briefly before he turned away. "I didn't mean to pry," she said quietly. "It was covered in dust. I cleaned it." He didn't answer. But later, when she went to her room, she found something on her dresser, a hand-carved wooden comb, the kind made by patient hands. She touched it gently, realizing it was his silent way of saying thank you. That night, the house felt less like a prison of quiet and more like a space that was waiting to be filled with something softer. Evelyn sat by the window, brushing her hair with the wooden comb, and listened to the wind moving over the plains. It was still silent, but not empty. For the first time since arriving, she thought maybe the silence wasn't meant to punish her. Maybe it was meant to test if she was strong enough to listen. Days turned into weeks, and the silence that had once felt suffocating began to settle around Evelyn like a strange sort of rhythm. Each morning she rose before dawn, lit the stove, and watched the sky bleed from violet to gold. Luke was always gone by the time she opened her eyes, out with the horses, repairing fences, or tending to the cattle on the far ridge. He worked hard, moved with purpose, but spoke to no one. The ranch hands treated him with wary respect, like a man who carried too much sorrow to be questioned. They barely spoke to Evelyn either, not out of cruelty, but uncertainty. A black woman on a white man's ranch was something Iron Creek had never seen before. The men didn't know how to treat her, as a lady, as the boss's wife, or as someone who'd disappear like the others before her. Because there had been others. One of the older workers, an Irishman named Brennan, told her in a quiet moment that Luke had married once before. "Didn't last a month," Brennan muttered, tossing hay into the trough. "She left one night." Didn't take a thing with her but her shoes. Evelyn didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of the ghosts in the house. Rooms that seemed to remember arguments that were never spoken aloud, and doors that closed themselves when the wind rose. Still, she stayed. She cleaned, cooked, and learned the rhythms of the ranch. She fed the chickens, mended clothes, and rode into town once a week for supplies. Luke never asked her to do any of it, but he didn't stop her either. That was how they communicated, through small actions. If he left extra firewood by her door, she knew he'd notice the cold. If she fixed his torn sleeve, he wore the shirt the next day without comment. It was a language built not on words, but on care. And yet, there were moments when Evelyn felt her resolve slipping. On nights when the wind howled through the cracks, she would sit by the hearth and whisper aloud just to hear a voice in the room. "You don't have to talk," she once said softly, looking at him across the table. "But I wish you would." He didn't answer. He only looked at her, really looked, and something in his eyes flickered, a silent apology or a memory she couldn't name. Then he stood, took his hat, and walked out into the night. That was the hardest part, not his silence, but the feeling that he carried a burden too deep for her to reach. She wasn't afraid of him, not anymore. But she was afraid he might never let her in. One afternoon, after a long day of mending fences, Evelyn found a small surprise waiting for her. A sprig of lavender tied with twine left on her windowsill. She smiled despite herself. There were no lavender plants on the ranch. He must have ridden miles to find it. That evening, she placed the sprig in a cup of water beside the wooden comb he'd given her. The sight of them, two simple tokens from a man who never spoke, made something warm and unfamiliar stir in her chest. Later that night, as she stood outside watching the stars, Brennan passed by leading a horse. He tipped his hat. "You've lasted longer than the rest, Mrs. McKenna," he said. "Guess you've got grit." Evelyn smiled faintly. "It's not grit," she replied. "It's choice." When she went back inside, she found Luke sitting at the table, the firelight flickering across his face. He didn't look up as she entered, but his hand brushed the chair beside him, an invitation. She sat down quietly. Neither spoke. The silence stretched, but for the first time, it felt like a bridge instead of a wall. Evelyn understood then. She wasn't just surviving. She was building something, slow and fragile, in the quiet space between two wounded hearts. And she wasn't going anywhere. The first time Evelyn went into town after the wedding, the streets went quiet. It wasn't to the kind of silence she'd learned to love on the ranch. The soft hush of wind through grass, the easy quiet that came from Luke's presence. No, this silence was heavy, sharp and watching. Iron Creek was a small settlement, a handful of shops, a church, a saloon, and a row of wooden homes that leaned together against the wind. As she stepped down from the wagon, she could feel every eye turned toward her. The general store door swung open, and Mrs. Harlan, the preacher's wife, froze mid-step. Her gaze swept over Evelyn's dark skin, her modest blue dress, and the plain gold band on her finger. "Well," Mrs. Harlan said after a moment, her voice dripping with something like disbelief, "so it's true." The mute cowboy finally found himself a wife. Evelyn smiled, polite and steady. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Mrs. McKenna." A whisper rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Some faces turned away quickly. Others stared, curious or disapproving. A few offered nods that felt more like pity than welcome. Inside the general store, the clerk, Mr. Duffy, fumbled with the sugar jars. "Heard tell you married Luke," he said carefully. "That man don't talk much. He says what needs saying," Evelyn replied, placing her list on the counter. "And he works harder than most men who do." The man blinked, taken aback by her tone. She wasn't angry, just firm, grounded, the way her father had taught her to speak when someone doubted her worth. As she shopped, She overheard the murmurs swirling around her like flies. He went half mad after his brother died. They say he don't speak 'cause he shot him by mistake. She must have married for money. No decent woman would live with a man like that. Evelyn kept her head high, but each word landed like a small stone in her chest. When she left, the wind picked up, tossing her skirt and carrying those whispers away, though not far enough. That evening, as she unpacked the supplies, Luke entered the kitchen. He glanced at her, then at the basket. He could tell something had unsettled her. She could see it in the faint crease between his brows. "Town was lively," she said, forcing a smile. "Everyone had something to say about the man who doesn't." His hands stilled. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he walked to the sink, washed his hands, and handed her a folded cloth. His eyes met hers, steady, searching, almost asking, "What did they say? Did they hurt you?" She shook her head. "They talk because they don't know you." His gaze softened, though his jaw stayed tight. He turned back toward the window, staring into the wide, open dark. Evelyn stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You don't have to hide from them forever. Luke, people will keep telling stories until you give them a better one." He didn't move for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad and pencil, old, worn at the edges. He scribbled something quickly, then handed it to her. "Some things are easier left unsaid." Evelyn looked at the words, then at him. "And some things deserve to be heard." For a second, something like a smile tugged at his mouth, faint but real. He reached out, brushed a loose curl from her forehead, and left without a word. Later that night, as she sat by the fire reading the note again, Evelyn realized what truly set the town's whispers apart from the silence on the ranch. Their gossip was born of ignorance. His silence, though, his was born of pain. And though the world feared a quiet man, she was beginning to see the beauty in his wordless truths. The next time she went into town, she held her head higher. Let them whisper. She had already found her peace, not in what people said, but in what one man refused to. The days after the letter passed in a blur of quiet uncertainty. Evelyn went about her chores as she always did, feeding the hens, mending fences, cooking meals, but her heart was no longer steady. Each task, each sunrise, each look from Luke felt heavier, as though the land itself were asking her to choose. Luke had said little since the evening on the porch. He never pressed her for an answer. That was his way. He didn't demand or persuade, he simply waited. But she could feel the weight of his silence following her through every room. At night, she lay awake listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods, wondering if it would sound the same back home. She imagined her mother's arms, her brother's laughter, and yet every image felt distant, like a life she'd already lived. Here, on the ranch, things had changed her. He had changed her. One morning, before dawn, Evelyn saddled a horse and rode to the far edge of the property, the place where the hills rolled down toward the creek. The mist was rising, soft and silver, and the first light of day spilled gently across the water. It was peaceful there, untouched by anything but the whisper of wind. She closed her eyes, breathed in the quiet, and realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. She didn't miss her old life anymore. The loneliness that had once frightened her had become her strength. And in Luke's silence, she had found something far deeper than word safety. When she returned, Luke was in the barn, working. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his arms flecked with sawdust. He looked up as she entered, eyes calm but searching. "You were gone early," he said. "I needed to think," she replied softly. He nodded once. "And did you?" She smiled faintly. "I did." For a long time they stood there, neither speaking. Dust motes drifted through the light between them. Evelyn took a step closer, her heart pounding. "When I came here," she said, "I thought this marriage was just duty. But somewhere along the way, I stopped counting the days until I could leave. Luke lowered his tools, his jaw tightening. So you've decided? Yes, she paused, searching his face. But I need to know something first. His brow furrowed slightly. Why did you choose me? She asked. Out of everyone, why the woman nobody wanted? He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried years of things unsaid. Then, instead of speaking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded square of paper. Evelyn frowned, taking it. It was worn, creased from being opened many times. Inside was a drawing, rough but tender, of a woman standing beside a horse, the ranch behind her. The details were unmistakable, her. When did you draw this? She whispered. The night you arrived, he said quietly. Before I even knew your name. Tears filled her eyes. You saw me that way, even then? He nodded once. You looked strong, tired, but strong, I thought. Maybe you could understand silence. She stared at him, her throat tight, her heart trembling. He didn't move closer, didn't touch her, didn't say the words she longed to hear, but he didn't need to. His eyes said them for him. So she stepped forward, closing the space between them, and laid her hand against his chest. His heartbeat was steady beneath her palm. I'm not leaving, she whispered. Luke's hand came up to rest over hers, his voice low and rough with emotion. Good. And in that single word, that one, simple sound, Evelyn heard everything she'd been waiting for: love, gratitude, fear, and belonging. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they'd never needed to say aloud. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell quietly, blanketing the plains in silver before dawn. Evelyn woke to the stillness, the kind that made the world feel new again. From the window, she could see Luke outside, already at work, his figure a dark silhouette against the soft white light. It had been weeks since she told him she wasn't leaving. The letter from her mother now rested in a drawer, folded neatly beside the little wooden bird. She had written back, telling her family the truth, that she had found her place, not through obligation but through love. Her mother's reply had been simple. Then you are home, child. The ranch had changed too. Luke smiled more often now, even laughed sometimes. A low, rumbling sound that still startled her in the best way. He spoke when it mattered, but he didn't force words when silence said enough. Together, they rebuilt what had once been broken. The barn stood tall again, painted fresh red against the white snow. The fences were mended, the horses well fed. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Evelyn realized the ranch no longer felt like his alone. It was theirs. That evening, she found him sitting by the fire, carving another piece of wood. She settled beside him, watching the knife move in steady strokes. What are you making this time? She asked. He glanced up briefly, a small smile tugging at his lips. You'll see. When he finally handed it to her, she laughed softly. It was two small figures, a man and a woman sitting side by side on a porch, heads tilted toward one another in quiet companionship. Their faces were rough, barely detailed, yet somehow they looked alive. It's us, she said gently. He nodded once. You and me. For a while neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, the wind hummed against the windows, and somewhere outside the horses stamped in their stalls. Evelyn thought back to the woman she'd been, desperate, afraid, bound by duty. She barely recognized that version of herself now. The life she'd built with Luke wasn't easy, but it was honest. There was no pretending, no need to fill the silence with empty words. He had taught her that peace didn't always sound like laughter or conversation. Sometimes it sounded like breathing beside someone who understood you completely. Later that night, she went outside. The snow had stopped falling, and the stars glittered sharp and cold above the plains. Luke joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Cold? He asked. A little, she said, smiling. But it's beautiful. He followed her gaze to the sky. It is. Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder. You know, when I first came here, I thought silence was loneliness. I thought it was something to fear. And now? He asked softly. She turned toward him, her breath misting in the cold air. Now I know it's love. Luke didn't answer, but he didn't need to. He reached for her hand, holding it firmly in his, and together they stood watching the horizon, the dark line where sky met land, where everything began and ended. When dawn came, its light spilling gold over the snow, the world seemed to breathe again. Evelyn felt it too, the deep, steady peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be. The black woman who had married the cowboy nobody wanted had found not just shelter, not just safety, but belonging. And in the quiet strength of his silence, she had found the truest sound of love. The rain began as a whisper, a faint tapping on the windows, soft and steady. Evelyn was in the kitchen when the wind shifted, bringing with it the metallic scent of lightning. Out on the horizon, black clouds gathered like a promise. She hurried to shut the shutters, calling out instinctively, "Luke, the storm's coming." There was no answer. She stepped out onto the porch, shielding her eyes against the rising wind. He was out by the barn, trying to fasten the gate before the storm hit. The horses were restless, stamping and snorting at the scent of rain. She ran to him, her skirts tangling around her legs. "Luke, come inside," she shouted. "You'll get caught out here." He turned briefly, rain streaking his face, and shook his head. He was trying to secure the roof planks that had come loose, moving with the urgency of a man used to fixing things before they broke. The sky cracked open with thunder, and the rain came down hard, drenching them both within seconds. Evelyn grabbed the edge of a tarp and tried to help him tie it down, but the wind ripped it from her hands. A flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening crash. The old oak by the paddock took a direct hit, splintering into flames. The horses screamed. "Luke!" she cried, stumbling backward. The ground was slick with mud. Before she could find her footing, a loud creak split the air. One of the barn's upper beams had broken loose, swaying dangerously. Luke saw it before she did. "Down!" The word ripped from his throat like thunder, deep, raw, and desperate. He lunged forward, knocking her to the ground as the beam crashed inches from where she'd been standing. The sound echoed through the barn, followed by the frantic breathing of two people who had just outrun death. For a long moment, neither moved. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel his weight pressed protectively against her, his breath ragged and warm against her cheek. When he finally lifted his head, their eyes met, and what she saw there was not fear, but something softer. He spoke again, his voice rough with disuse. "Are you hurt?" She could barely breathe. It was the first time she'd heard him truly speak, not a whisper or a mutter, but a voice. A real voice. "No," she said softly. "I'm all right." He nodded once, pushing himself to his feet. For a moment, it looked like he might retreat again into silence, but instead he turned toward her and began to talk, haltingly, unevenly. "My brother," his voice cracked, the rest of the words buried under the sound of the storm. He tried again. "He died. The last words I said to him, we argued. Over nothing. I told him to shut up. He went out in the storm that night. Never came back." Evelyn rose slowly, her dress soaked and clinging to her. She didn't speak, didn't press him. She simply stepped closer, letting the rain wash over them both. Luke's eyes glistened in the lightning's flash, a man haunted by guilt he had carried alone for years. "I thought, if I didn't speak, I couldn't hurt anyone again," he said, voice breaking on the words. Evelyn reached up, her hand trembling, and touched his cheek. "You can't hide from pain, Luke. Silence won't keep it from finding you." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch just slightly, a man unlearning his own walls. For the first time, she didn't see the rancher everyone whispered about. She saw a wounded soul trying to remember what it meant to live. The rain began to ease, softening to a mist. Together, they walked back to the house, two figures soaked through, carrying a shared secret that felt like the first fragile bridge between them. That night, when Evelyn lay in bed, she could still hear his voice echoing softly in her mind. "Down. Are you hurt?" "My brother." And for the first time since their marriage began, the silence between them felt different, not empty, but waiting. The morning after the storm, the world was washed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the ranch shimmered under a soft gray mist. Evelyn woke with an ache in her arms and mud still streaked across her skin. Her dress hung damp near the fire, and her hair clung to her shoulders in loose waves. She moved quietly through the house, listening. The usual rhythm, the creak of the porch boards, the distant call of horses, was broken by a heavy stillness. When she stepped into the kitchen, she saw him sitting by the window, his arm bound crudely in a strip of cloth. "Luke," she said softly. "You're hurt." He didn't look at her at first. His jaw was tight, his gaze distant, fixed on the rain-drenched hills beyond the glass. But when she came closer, she saw the blood soaking through the bandage. The beam that had fallen must have grazed him. Without asking, she fetched a bowl of water, clean rags, and her mother's old tin of salve. "Sit still," she murmured. "I'll fix it." He hesitated, watching her. For a man who trusted no one, letting someone close was a foreign act. But after a long pause, he nodded. Evelyn knelt beside him, carefully unwrapping the cloth. The wound wasn't deep, but it had bled badly. Her fingers brushed his skin, rough from years of work, sun-browned and scarred. He flinched at first, but then he stilled, muscles softening beneath her touch. "You should have told me," she said quietly. "You shouldn't have been out there alone." His voice came low, gravelly from disuse. "Didn't want to scare the horses," she smiled faintly. "You nearly scared me to death instead." For the first time, something like amusement flickered in his eyes. It wasn't quite a smile, but close. Evelyn dipped the rag into the water and began to clean the wound. Each motion was slow, deliberate. She could feel his heartbeat thrumming under her fingertips. He watched her closely, her steady hands, her calm expression, the way she hummed softly under her breath. She wasn't afraid of his silence or his scars. No one had ever looked at him that way before, not with pity or fear, but quiet strength. When she finished, she tied the fresh bandage and looked up. "There," she said, meeting his gaze. "Good as new." Luke's eyes softened. For a long moment, he didn't look away. Then, hesitantly, he reached for something on the table, his notepad. He wrote slowly, then turned it toward her. "You shouldn't have to take care of me." Evelyn read the words, then smiled gently. "You're my husband, Luke. I'm supposed to." He stared at her as if trying to understand the truth in her tone. His throat worked, but no words came. Instead, he reached for her hand, rough palm against soft skin, and held it, just long enough for her breath to catch. When he finally let go, she felt the loss like a chill. But his eyes said what his mouth couldn't: "Thank you." The rest of the day passed in quiet work. Evelyn mended the roof while Luke checked the livestock. They didn't speak, but something had shifted between them, the fragile beginnings of trust. That night, as the firelight flickered across the walls, Evelyn brushed her hair with the wooden comb he'd carved for her. She heard his footsteps pause outside her door, the creak of the floorboards, then retreat. He hadn't come to her, not yet, but his presence lingered like a promise. Before blowing out the lamp, she whispered into the stillness, "You don't have to speak for me to hear you, Luke." And though there was no reply, she could almost feel his answer in the quiet that followed, a silence that no longer felt empty, but full of everything left unspoken between them. By midsummer, the plains had turned gold beneath the sun, and the air shimmered with heat. The storm that had nearly torn the ranch apart now felt like a distant memory, but for Evelyn, it had changed everything. Luke spoke to her now, rarely but enough to prove that the silence between them was no longer made of fear. Each word he offered was a small victory, a fragment of trust. Still, Iron Creek had a way of holding on to gossip. The townsfolk hadn't forgiven Luke for his solitude or Evelyn for breaking their quiet rules. The talk had grown worse since she'd started coming to town more often, buying lumber, nails, and fabric as she helped Luke rebuild the barn. Some said she had bewitched him. Others said he only kept her there because no other woman would have him. One afternoon, the town held its annual harvest gathering at the churchyard, an unspoken expectation for every landowner to attend. Evelyn wanted to go. Luke didn't. "They'll talk," he said quietly, avoiding her eyes. "They already do," she replied, folding her shawl. "Might as well let them see who we really are." He said nothing after that, but when she hitched the wagon, he joined her. When they arrived, conversation dipped again, just as it always did. Children were pulled closer to their mothers. Men removed their hats but didn't smile. Evelyn held her head high, her arm brushing Luke's as they walked through the crowd. Brennan, their ranch hand, nodded to them from the edge of the field. "Don't mind the fools," he muttered under his breath. "You've both earned your place here." She thanked him, but the words barely had time to settle before a familiar voice rang out, sharp and mocking. "Well, look who decided to crawl out of the hills." The McKenna mute and his colored bride. The laughter that followed was cruel and quick. Evelyn froze. The man who'd spoken was Tom Cates, a rancher known for his loud mouth and empty drink glass. He swaggered toward them, his smirk wide. "Tell me, Mrs. McKenna," he sneered, "does he talk yet, or do you have to do all the speaking for him?" For a heartbeat, Luke didn't move. He stood still, his hand hovering near hers, not in restraint, but in warning. "Let it go," his eyes said. But Evelyn's fire had been waiting too long to stay quiet. She stepped forward, her chin high, her voice clear enough for everyone to hear. "My husband may not talk as much as you do, Mr. Cates," she said, "but when he does, his words carry weight. Yours, on the other hand, blow away with the dust." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Tom's face flushed red, but she wasn't done. "You call him mute," she continued, "but I've seen him calm wild horses with a gesture. I've seen him rebuild a roof with his bare hands. I've ever heard him say more in silence than you could manage in a lifetime of shouting." The air went still. Even the wind seemed to hush. Luke's hand tightened at his side, and when she glanced back, his eyes were fixed on her, a mix of astonishment, pride, and something deeper. Tom tried to laugh it off, muttering something about uppity women, but no one joined him this time. Brennan stepped forward, his tone dry. "Reckon the lady's right," he said. "Ain't much good comes from flapping jaws." Tom turned away, humiliated, and the tension broke. The music resumed, the whispers fading into something softer. Evelyn turned to Luke, her heart still racing. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head. Then, in a voice so low she almost didn't catch it, he said, "Don't be." It was only 2 words, but they filled her with warmth. For the first time, he smiled, small and fleeting, but real. And in that moment, surrounded by the same people who had once pitied her, Evelyn realized she'd done more than defend him. She had given him back his dignity, and perhaps the courage to begin again. Autumn crept quietly across Iron Creek. The leaves turned brittle and gold, and the air grew cool enough that Evelyn took to lighting the fire before dawn. The ranch had settled into a rhythm now, one that belonged as much to her as to Luke. She woke before him most mornings, made coffee, and sat by the window to watch the light spread over the plains. The silence between them no longer felt awkward. It had become a kind of language, filled with unspoken things, comfortable pauses, small looks that said what words could not. Luke spoke more now, in soft, measured tones. He still preferred quiet, but when he did speak, it was to her, never anyone else. His voice had grown rougher with time, but also warmer. He had started carving again. In the evenings, while she sewed by the fire, he'd sit nearby with his knife and a block of wood, shaping it patiently. Once she'd asked what he was making. "You'll see," he'd said. That answer, simple but sure, had made her smile. It was a peaceful time, the kind that makes one forget the world beyond the horizon, until the letter came. It arrived one crisp morning in late October, tucked between the day's post. The envelope was worn, the ink smudged, her mother's handwriting. Evelyn felt her heart lurch as she broke the seal. "My dearest Evie, the Lord has been kind. The bank forgave the last of our debt, a miracle, we think. Your brothers are working again, and the farm will make it through the winter. We owe it all to you. You don't have to stay there now, not out of duty. Come home, child. Come home where you belong. Asterisk. Her hands trembled as she read. The words were meant to be comforting, yet they unsettled her deeply. For months, she had told herself she'd married Luke for survival, for her family's sake, not her own. She'd never imagined she might one day want to stay. That evening, she sat on the porch, the letter folded tightly in her palm. Luke joined her silently, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. The sky was painted in streaks of pink and gold, and the scent of wood smoke drifted through the air. He glanced at the letter. "Bad news?" Evelyn hesitated. "Good, actually. My family's debts are paid. I could go home." Luke's expression didn't change at first, but she saw the faint tightening of his jaw, the way his hands wrapped too tightly around his mug. "I see," he said quietly. She looked out toward the fields, her throat tightening. "When I came here, I thought this was just a bargain. A way to save them. I didn't expect." She trailed off, searching for words. He turned toward her then, his gaze steady, his voice low. "Didn't expect what?" Evelyn swallowed. "To find peace here. To find you." For a long while they sat without speaking. The wind moved softly through the grass, carrying the scent of rain and distance. Finally, Luke reached into his pocket and handed her something small and wooden. A tiny carving of a bird, wings spread wide as if caught mid-flight. "For you," he said. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingers. "It's beautiful. It's free," he said quietly. "Like you." The words struck deep. He wasn't asking her to stay. He was giving her the choice, and that, she realized, was love in its truest form. Evelyn closed her hand around the carving. The bird was small, but it felt like the weight of her heart. She looked at Luke, this quiet man who spoke in gestures and carried sorrow like shadow, and she knew her decision before she even made it. She had come here to save her family. But somewhere between silence and storms, she had found herself instead.